There might not be anything as iconic in the Western world than the classic Universal monsters. Dracula and Frankenstein are such pillars of culture that even children know them by their name more than 100 years after their inceptions in written form. But what arguably brought them to the forefront for a lot of people was the lineage of Universal Studios films, starting in 1913. There are decades of films and many, many monsters among them, from the Wolfman to the creature from Black Lagoon, the Mummy, Bride of Frankenstein, or even his son. One of the original slew certainly got his fair share of attention, but in my opinion started to fade away in comparison to his more famous compatriots. Of course, I'm referring to The Invisible Man. Coming from a book named after the titular character written in 1897 by the acclaimed sci-fi legend H.G. Wells. He then got a film adaptation in 1933 directed by James Whale. He also helmed the original film of Frankenstein just 2 years earlier. The Invisible Man is adorned in his classic look, a large coat, fedora, glasses, and a completely bandaged face. It is a fun and pulpy story of a mad scientist gone too far, affected by his own experiments both physically and psychologically, at least in the film. As I slowly discover the fascinating world of these old classics, I thought it would be fun to revisit a character that has not exactly maintained his legacy, and we'll discover what made it so affecting in the first place while sharing some information on the filming process and history behind such a character. Now, I'm going to quickly run through the plot points to set a basis for what I'm going to discuss, but I'll say it up front, I do recommend you giving this movie a watch before even enjoying this video. Not just because you'll be subject to spoilers, but I do think it holds up today. It is a tight 71 minutes, and it's available for free on the Internet Archive. In fact, I've put a link to the movie in the description, which you can check out whenever you please. So without further ado, let's just jump into it. The 1933 film, The Invisible Man. The film opens on a snowy day as we watch a slightly enigmatic stranger book a lodging at the local inn. We follow him as he makes himself at home while almost warring with the proprietress and some of the patrons. Theories and speculation spreads on why he could be hiding himself. Chief among them is the idea that he's a criminal running from justice. He hides his true nature from them as best he can, and insists on solitude, which gets routinely interrupted. Through these interruptions, we the viewer start to see a few glimpses under the wraps around his head. This provides us the first opportunity to gawk at the effects, which start off quite weak. I think the first shot of his jaw is kind of poorly composited together, leaving the edges sort of fuzzy. We'll get into why that specifically was the case later. Once this strange man's luggage has arrived, he quickly fills the room with lots of test tubes, substances, and equipment for scientific inquiry. Over the next few weeks, he dedicates himself to his work alone. It is here that we cut away and discover the likely identity of the man. A scientist talks with his daughter Flora, who is missing a Dr. Jack Griffin. He was working under the scientist, Dr. Cranley, but took a leave for about a month to continue his own experiments. His whereabouts are unknown, and he did not alert Flora when leaving, despite the two being engaged. Cranley's other assistant, Dr. Kemp, tries to console Flora, but sort of inserts himself as an alternative romantic option. Finally, we cut back to the Invisible Man, who at this point we now understand to be Jack. One day, the owner of the place confronts Jack on his rent payments slipping. An altercation between them begins, and the stranger throws the man downstairs, causing some serious harm. Unable to do much else, the locals call the police to evict him, and once the policeman arrives, the stranger reaches his breaking point. Up until now, he's been quite shameful, short, and rude to those around him, but now he loses it and goes full manic. In a dramatic flourish, he undoes his head wraps and reveals that he is an invisible man. Quite the moment. Here, we really get a good look at the visuals, and I think they are a lot more effective than the smaller hint from earlier. For all intents and purposes, the effect just works. It is fairly convincing, even if your mind drifts to all the practical methods used to achieve it. It's, of course, hard to truly believe this sort of thing, though I would say the exact same for most modern-day CGI. The practical nature of old films like this usually makes it feel more grounded, and I think it does what it needs to. It conveys the mystical and almost worrying wonderment that the character in the scenes are experiencing. It's a pretty impressive translation of the character to live action. But getting back to the story, Jack begins to go on a rampage. He fights back against the policeman and begins taunting the town. This is where the tone really sets into place. It's what I would consider a horror comedy, which makes more sense considering the influences we'll discuss later. After his big outburst, the core of the film's conflict starts. The police commissioner has to investigate the situation, mostly not believing what had happened. Meanwhile, Jack goes to seek out Kemp and uses him to be his accomplice for his fittingly ridiculous newfound goal of taking over the world. We eventually discover through the doctor he was studying under that the drugs that are making him invisible also make him violent and megalomaniacal. The rest of the film has Kemp trying to break free of Jack's control over him, while Jack wars with the police and the locals, even killing the commissioner early on, spurring on an almost nationwide search for the Invisible Man. It ends quite simply, with a small town farmer discovering Jack asleep in his barn. He calls the police over, who shoots Jack. As he slowly dies in the hospital bed, he gets a quiet moment with Flora. The serum drains from his body, finally revealing his true form as he passes away. Overall, it's a obviously very simple but effective plot, following what amounts to the villain of the story from the very start until his well-deserved downfall. I think it does a good job providing the context and stakes to the real meat of the experience, which is the power of that simple concept, an Invisible Man driven mad. What I would say my biggest issue is that there really isn't any meaning or depth to it. I thought it was going in a fairly interesting direction early on. The paranoia of the main character is quite interesting, and the interplay between that severe anxiety and shame while literally being invisible is kinda genius. Being terrified to be seen with an invisible body, I love it. The mania he experiences a little later is a little less interesting, and by the time the plot basically says all of it's just due to the drugs that make him crazy, I was a little deflated. Feels like a waste of a really strong concept. But for the goals they did have, it achieves it well. In fact, I wasn't expecting the interesting, almost xenophobic fear captured in the film. It is anxious of the other, the outsider, the one man who can stroll into town without you even knowing, but you would feel his presence without even seeing him. It does provide some depth, and sometimes it's really hard to tell if the movie is critical of this fear or reveling in it itself. As I would go on to describe later, there are a couple thematic and political themes left out of this adaptation, which I think is a good way to get into the history and production of this movie. It is a fascinating story. So, James Whale was the director of this picture, and he is quite the filmmaker. Inspired by many German expressionist movies, including the works of Paul Leni, one of his most prevalent films is The Man Who Laughs from 1928, which I hope to see soon. Despite that film being intended as a romantic drama, it's often misconstrued as a horror, more in line with its contemporaries due to the main character's frightening grin. These German expressionistic works often blended horror and comedy in quite a unique way. I think that absolutely shines through into The Invisible Man. The sudden switches from mischievous playfulness to intense violence give the film a now unique texture that I really enjoy. I think this is where the influences shine most brightly. But the truly curious thing about this movie is the central question. How did they film The Invisible Man? When his clothes are completely removed, the effect is quite simple. A little bit of voiceover narrating, the work of strings and wires, can accomplish most, if not all, the scenes of the completely invisible man. The biggest trouble was when he was partially clothed, but had some invisible parts exposed. What they did was, they covered the parts of his body which were going to be removed in plain black cloth. They filmed him in sets made completely black so that it would blend in with the background and only the clothes clinging to him would remain. Then they had to use a negative of this reel, a duplicate, and a positive to composite the entire thing together. According to the special effects supervisor, John Fulton, the most difficult part was matching the lighting on his clothes to the natural lighting of the scene it was being placed in. Some of the shots, which only required the work of finer details, such as eye holes and the like, was touched up frame by frame with a brush and an opaque dye. That's where the first scene we saw of just his jaw comes from. I was using a documentary as one of my sources for this video, and they described the most difficult shot for the film, in which the Invisible Man unwraps his head in front of the mirror. They put it so well, so I'm just going to play that here.
This required the filming of 4 separate pieces of film, and later combining them together, because you needed to film the back of the Invisible Man as he is unwrapping it. You needed to film the room that he's seated in, where he does this. Then for the reflection part, you needed to film the wall that is in the reflection, and separately, you needed to film the front of the Invisible Man as he unwraps himself. He said that was the most difficult shot he'd ever done.
Overall, the special effects were exhaustive. While filming began in June and ended in August, apparently the special effects took upwards of 4 months to complete. John Fulton says the 64,000 frames were touched up and fixed by hand. It was an absolute labor of love as they adapted what seemed like an impossibility in live-action film, especially at the time. As for acting, I usually find a lot of movies from this period leaving a lot to be desired. Modern audiences are absolutely spoiled with the amount of breathtaking performances out there, whether absurd and almost indescribable in its execution, or subtly acting as an art form. It's all changed a lot throughout history. This was at a point where audio and film was still an exciting and new thing, and the ham-fisted acting of the stage didn't always translate well to the screen, where the audience is supposed to believe what is happening a lot more directly. After all the work they put in with making the effects realistic, a bad performance could have robbed this movie of its punch. But the actor Claude Rains did such a great job without any expressions at all. Considering he only has his voice and body language to go off of, the performance of Jack is almost as important as the special effects. His quiet rudeness, desperation for solitude, and overall mysterious air at the start of the film is done perfectly. He seems important but best to be left alone, and a bit of an asshole. But by the time he's pushed over and over until he just can't take it anymore, his jump into insanity feels just as realistic as it is exhilaratingly silly.
You're crazy to know who I am, aren't you? Alright, I'll show you!
The campy tone is never sacrificed with over-melodramatic line reads, nor is it relied on with something far too silly to ever be fearful of. Instead, he feels suitably insane, dancing from violence to mischief to something in between, perfectly matching the on-screen chaos he's orchestrating. However, like I teased earlier, there were some differences between the original and the movie. But what's curious about this is that the original author was still around at the time of filming and even got involved. Previously, there was a film, The Island of Lost Souls, which was an adaptation of another H.G. Wells story, The Island of Dr. Moreau. Apparently, neither director James Whale nor H.G. Wells was happy with how the production turned out due to meddling from Universal Studios. James Whale had initially outlined a far more political and thematically dense tale than the simple horror film it ended up being, and H.G. Wells was not happy with the liberties taken with his story. So Wells insisted that The Invisible Man would more closely follow his original book, and Wales desired a bit more creative freedom over what gets released to the public. But there were still many disagreements over this film as well. For one, Wells was not a fan of the megalomania of Jack Griffin in the film, as that was never part of his original story. The novel is able to touch on themes of contemporary society and why someone invisible would want to tear it down, as it existed far better than the film could. He managed to insist some changes, the author having some say over the script himself, but he still made some concessions to Hollywood in the end, and a lot of it was out of his hands. The exact details of what they argued over and what was changed from his influence is very hard to say. In the end, H.G. Wells did not like many, if at all, of the films adapting his work. A lot of the political themes from his work were never quite translated, and as an avid socialist himself, he took significant issue with this. This is unfortunately quite the common story in Hollywood, even at its inception, and now it's just a fascinating story of history. So, with all of this said and done, why does The Invisible Man work? What made the original novel so impactful, and the film adaptation in tow? I think, simply put, there is a powerful emotional core to the center of the story, following a quite enigmatic and notably destructive protagonist in either incarnation, whether that is more of the revolutionary found in the novel or the madman in the movie. It defies the usual structure because of this focus, which leaves it feeling so unique even a century after the book and a little less of that after the movie. Then comes the genuinely jaw-dropping special effects that carry over the film's simpler plot and themes. While it may not cause you to think as much as its original story, the dazzling effects offer their own experience, which I think remains valuable and genuinely spellbinding today. With such an oversaturation of weightless, disconnected CGI infecting every movie released, seeing the practical problems the creatives who worked on these movies had to overcome is wonderful. I don't mean to disparage the numerous artists working hard on the CGI the industry is so dependent on, but instead I blame the executives and the producers who rely on it as a crutch. So, I enjoyed this movie quite a bit. The performance from the lead actor, the special effects, and the interesting structure all makes it more than worth your while, but the history and production surrounding it is just as fascinating, and it's worth noting that it does not represent the best iteration of this character or this story. Meddling studio executives and creative differences between the director and Wells is all important context, and it shouldn't be ignored. I find myself fascinated by The Invisible Man, and with such a lengthy history on the silver screen, there's a lot more to enjoy and a lot more I intend to cover. So if you enjoyed this video and would like to see more, please do subscribe and stay notified for when I next release a video. Thank you so much for sticking around to the end, and if you're curious for yourself, I also left my sources and the documentary I reference in the description as well. They cover a lot more than I was able to in this video, so it's still absolutely worth a look. Have a lovely day, and thank you for watching.